And now, The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to The Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Thursday, February 19th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of The Federal Drive, the search for the next Comptroller General is turning into a mystery. No one even knows when the process will begin. Plus, we'll look back at major shifts across climate, labor, immigration, and other key policy areas that made 2025 a year of rapid regulatory change. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of The Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Postal Service typically sees its best financial results in the first quarter of each fiscal year. That's because of the year-end holiday season and sometimes a surge in political mail. But USPS is starting this fiscal year with a $1.3 billion net loss. It posted a rare net profit for the same period last year. The American Postal Workers Union says USPS should focus on affordable services and improved service to win back customers. Federal News Network's Jory Heckman spoke with APWU President Jonathan Smith.
I'm looking for the Postal Service not only to be an affordable option, but to be a more realistic option. You have to realize that the Postal Service cannot be related just to the movement of mail. There's other services that we should be providing to our community. Fishing license. What about all these electric vehicles you try to put? Wouldn't it be nice to have electric vehicle stations at your post offices that we can use? What about when you're in town and you can't find a copy machine? And you say, I wonder where the Postal Service is at, and we can make copies right there at the Postal Service. Postal banking was a great idea and stuff like that. It's not something that we have not done before, and we showed that we could be very successful at that. And the other advantage of that is that we are the most trusted government service and have been the most trusted government service for a long time. When the American people feel a lot more comfortable having an ability to do these things, what about legislative initiatives that we can jointly equal into about them being able to take the pension funds and invest it in more than just treasury bonds? There's other ways to bring more finances into the Postal Service. What about giving us the opportunity to deliver liquor and stuff like that, which is a prohibition against that right now? There's all type of ideas. Privatization is not the idea. I have never known one business, unless you could tell me of one, that privatized and can proudly say that they offer better service at a cheaper rate.
As far as the idea of the Postal Service and their finances, it's been a rough couple of years for the Postal Service. They've been posting multi-billion-dollar net losses, and this is after Congress passed postal reform legislation that even after that, the Postal Service is still in rough shape. What do you feel it will take for the Postal Service to turn things around, to be an agency that can manage its books and still deliver for the American people?
If you take some of the services that I mentioned in the previous question and gave us an opportunity to bring more revenue into the Postal Service, we would not have a crisis. What we have is a crisis of open-mindedness, a crisis of services. Let me give you an example. You go into the Postal Service and you get frustrated because the line is going outside the door. And when you get inside the door, you see 8 windows there, but only 2 of those windows is open. Just saying, well, where's the other 6 people working these windows and this line can move, not realizing that that's all the employees we have, that there is nobody sitting in the back. There is nobody. The postal workers sitting there working through their lunch breaks. They work with little rest. They get in early and they leave late. The sacrifices that the postal worker has made need to be commended, because any time that we need to look at when Christmas go around and they want to give it to UPS and FedEx, where do it normally comes to at the end? It comes to the Postal Service, because we have proven that we the only ones that can handle this mission. So the problem is a lack of thinking outside the box, not a lack of finances. And that is, if you get our staffing together, we will remain what we've always been for the last 250 years, the best postal service in the world.
I want to stay on the issue of staffing for a little bit. I think it was last year that the Postal Service carried out early retirements for about 10,000 postal employees, some of them mail handlers, some of them APWU members. Now, I hear what you're saying about staffing. I've yet to meet a postal employee who said that their office was overly staffed. I mean, there's always the push for more staffing here. How significant is it for the Postal Service to be shedding employees at a time when the agency is always inundated with work?
Say I had a staffing of 20 employees and I got 5 supervisors. So they'll take those 20 employees and they'll cut it down to 10, mostly by attrition. 10 people retired, they don't replace them. So we'll use your early retirement as an example. So now I got 10 people, but guess what I got? I still got 5 supervisors. So if it was an issue of staffing, if they want to save some money, why don't you get rid of some of these supervisors, some of these managers, because you don't need 5 supervisors to supervise 20 employees.
So you're saying the mix of supervisors to frontline staff is off?
What I'm saying, it doesn't make sense. One of the arguments that they'll make, they'll say, oh, we need to cut jobs because we don't have the mail volume, right? Okay, that makes sense. But the problem is your overtime is going through the roof. So if you didn't have the mail volume, you're paying overtime for people to sit there and do nothing? It doesn't pass the test of common sense. So I'm saying, yeah, you can make any argument and you can make numbers say whatever you want them to say. If you talk to the employees and how hard they're working and how they got to work through lunch because they can't get a break, that'll tell you something different. They are not passing the test of common sense to support whatever argument they claim to be making about the labor costs and there's too many employees. No, it's not too many employees. There's not enough employees. If you want to make the Postal Service better, then start making better decisions. And that's what the problem is. It's bad decisions, not bad workers.
Changing gears here a little bit, last year, former Postmaster General Louis DeJoy agreed to work with DOJ on a couple of issues. And one of the things he directed them to take a look at is the Postal Service's real estate footprint across the country. One thing about the Postal Service is it's in every community, that just about every household is very close to a post office, and that they are able to take advantage of a nationwide utility. And what are your concerns as DOJ continues to take a look at the Postal Service's presence in so many different communities?
They're looking at money. I come from New York, and I had to fight them off from trying to take a lot of our facilities and closing those facilities. You got to realize that some of those facilities are beautiful, historic facilities in very good locations. But guess what? Every time they tried to close one of those facilities, the proposal was to build condos, to build stuff that does not fit the community that they're in. It's a money grab. That's exactly what it is. And they want these facilities because they're after money and they're not after service. They don't realize that they keep trying to pigeonhole the Postal Service as a business when the Postal Service is a service. It is a service. So the concentration should be to offer more services to the communities that they serve. First, tell me what initiative had they put into place to bring more revenue into the Postal Service. Now tell me that's not working. Don't tell me your theory, because they're giving you theory with no evidence to support it. There's no evidence to support any of this is working. It's nothing more than a money grab.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about last year's peak holiday season, always crunch time for the Postal Service. What would you say about the Postal Service workforce's ability to carry out the holiday season? What have you heard from your members as far as how the holiday season went?
I heard what I hear every year. No matter what the obstacle is, we deliver. The people that I represent went to work every day. They processed the mail every day. They made sure it got to every home that we were supposed to deliver to every single day. We did what we do every holiday season. We delivered. We did our job to the best of our ability. Now, I haven't heard any major complaints about the delivery service during the peak season, but it is my understanding that we had a very successful season like we always have, despite some of the regulations and some of the obstacles they put in place, such as delivery network and stuff like that, which we have no control over. But what we did have control over, we did very well, like we always do. We delivered America's mail.
That was Jonathan Smith, president of the American Postal Workers Union, speaking with Federal News Network's Jory Heckman. You can find Jory's story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, major shifts across climate, labor, immigration, and other key policy areas made 2025 a year of rapid regulatory change. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The presidential transition in 2025 triggered an abrupt reversal across federal policymaking. with agencies shifting from one set of priorities to another almost instantaneously. That whiplash was intensified by a surge of midnight rules on the way out and rapid reversals on the way in, as well as a renewed push by President Trump to expand executive authority. We'll walk through how that turbulence is reshaping regulation with Finn Dobkin and Matthias Vesperoni of the George Washington University Regulatory Studies Center. Finn and Matthias, it's great to have you on the show this morning.
Happy to be here.
Finn, let me begin with you. Last year's regulatory story was really dominated by the presidential transition, and that kind of led to a pivot in policymaking. We've seen a lot of executive orders and maybe less in the rulemaking space. Kind of lay out how that transition shaped the regulatory landscape for us.
Yeah, so obviously there's a lot going on last year. I think the main theme that you pointed out here was that there's a lot of actions by executive order. And I think a lot of attempts to centralize rulemaking into OIRA and the executive office of the president, perhaps more than we typically saw. I think a few good examples of that are now, for example, independent agencies are required to submit certain rules for OIRA review. That wasn't a thing in the past. We saw independent agencies. We saw firings of certain members of independent agencies. That wasn't a huge theme before. And so I think that there's overall this general theme of moving towards centralizing a lot of those regulatory powers within the presidency. And so I think that's really going to be something to look out for in the upcoming year and the remainder of the administration, but also just a good way to reflect on the past year in regulation.
It's a really helpful framing. Matthias, the team that did the review pointed out that, as a reminder, outgoing administrations try to entrench last-minute rules and incoming administrations try to undo them as quickly as possible. What stood out to you about how that back and forth played out in 2025?
Yeah, so it's been a big trend to kind of lean on deregulation in general, and that's kind of speaking towards what you were saying about trying to get rid of what the previous administration had kind of imposed during their time there. And this was kind of really seen by changing a little bit the OIRA procedures, and again through executive action, as Finn had mentioned. And this was kind of seen through, making OIRA go and check on independent agencies' rulemaking and also make it easier for them to review deregulation by making the time spent on deregulation minimal and making it go from 120 days to 28 days. So we see that what they really tried to aim for is to make the deregulation process as smooth and quick as possible.
Finn.
Yeah, I think one important thing to add there is that it wasn't just the presidency that was trying to get rid of Biden-era regulations. It was also Congress. And so because Republicans controlled both chambers and the presidency, they're able to effectively use the Congressional Review Act to rescind Biden-era regulations. And so we've seen that used quite extensively during the 119th Congress and are even seeing it being used in some novel ways with, for example, land management plans, which weren't historically something that the CRA was used for. Those are informal adjudications. They're typically less politically salient than say a major or significant rule. And so I think this is another novel use of trying to cut back the previous administration's rules.
The Congressional Review Act typically is something that's way in the background, and it has received quite a bit more attention this year. I think this is really really an important theme, and I think it's really goes to some major questions around thinking about how rules are impacting industry, either through the framework of regulatory uncertainty or through regulatory burden. Because I think one of the things with this is that when you have this sort of back and forth administration to administration or Congress to Congress, you tend to have a lot more uncertainty built up in the regulatory space. And I think that is, a theme that's worth noting during this past year is that you have a lot more going on in terms of just the volume of change has been quite significant. And I think there's been different responses to that across stakeholder groups. Matthias, I want to come back to you on the deregulation comment, because this administration had a rule, wasn't it? One regulation out, but you had to terminate 10 others before you could get a new one?
Yeah, so this was kind of an extension of what Trump had done in his first term, where he had the 2-to-1 rule, where you had to eliminate 2 rules to be able to propose a new one. And he basically escalated this by creating the 10-to-1, which is the same concept, except you now have to eliminate 10 rules to be able to impose a new one. And this is a big trend throughout the year because we've seen a lot of just rescinding rules and getting rid of old rules just to make space for new ones.
Are they holding to that 10-to-1 ratio?
It seems to be pretty well held, yes. People are deregulating quite a bit just to be able to keep up.
I'm speaking with Matthias Vesperoni and Finn Dobkin. Matthias is a policy analyst. Finn is a senior policy analyst, both at George Washington University's Regulatory Studies Center. Finn, let me come back to you. This review notes that in President Trump's second term, he's leaned heavily into a much more expansive approach to executive authority. How do you see that playing out in the regulatory space?
Yeah, like I said, there are some of these major themes around independent agency review. That's not typically – those have been fairly politically insulated in the past. And I think that's going to be a big theme in the coming year. Aside from the firings that we've seen at Merit Protections Board, at FCC, we're seeing some of these themes challenged in court directly. The independent agency, independent status has been justified under Humphrey's executor. That's a 1935 case that was before the Supreme Court. We're now seeing that challenged in Slaughter v. Trump, which is going to directly address that question, unlike some of the previous firings, which were sort of stopped at the district or appellate level. So I think that's a big one. Matthias highlighted a few of them with centralizing OIRA review with a 10-for-1 order. I think other than that, a big one is Jeffrey Clark, the associate administrator for OIRA. He issued a memo that set specific timelines for how quickly certain rules have to be reviewed by OIRA. That's going to not necessarily centralize review further, but it will definitely increase if it is successfully implemented, will increase the volume of rules that could potentially be reviewed by OIRA, or at the very least, increase the volume of rules reviewed by OIRA.
Matthias?
Yeah, and so a little bit adding to that, the Clark memo kind of gave a precedent for this administration kind of leaning on legal kind of exceptions to be used, mostly kind of like the good cause exception in the APA and other things, as well as the Loper Bright case. So we've seen a lot of these like legal exceptions also being used to kind of go through the deregulatory process as well.
Let's follow on with that, Finn. Let me come back to you on these legal cases. How do you expect those legal battles to shape the terrain for 2026?
Yeah, so I think some of the big things that are going to be salient here are some decisions from last year or from the year prior. For example, Loper Bright, which ended Chevron deference, has been moving down through the lower courts. And that basically actually is going to restrict what the federal government and agencies can and cannot do, because courts are no longer supposed to defer to a reasonable interpretation of a statute. And so that's going to have a major effect on what can be done by the agencies in that regard. And so I think that's going to be the main thing to look out for. I think SEC versus Jarkissi is another case that's sort of flowing down through the courts, and that relates to how administrative courts within agencies can pursue penalties. And so that's going to really restrict the EOP and executive branch agencies in a way that I think is in some ways running counter to what they're trying to do by centralizing powers.
Matthias, I want to change direction just a little bit and come back to you. The report highlights changes across 9 domains: climate change to energy to labor and immigration and others. Which of those domains do you think saw the most significant break from prior policy?
I think the ones that saw some significant break from prior policy are definitely, for example, the immigration, which kind of took a different stance, kind of leaning on national security as a main issue rather than the humanitarian approach that the prior administration had kind of taken with immigration regulation. And I think permitting also went through a lot of changes as well, and I think Finn can most likely talk a lot more on that section, and as well as a lot of deregulation in the financial sector, a lot of banking and market deregulation.
Those are all both headline topics and really consequential to how a lot of processes operate in the country. What do you expect to see as a result?
Well, as we have already kind of mentioned and reiterated, a lot of this is passed through executive action, so it's kind of hard to see how much of these changes will actually have an impact in the long term, if they'll last or if they'll hold. So we'll see, but I do suspect that the deregulatory trend will continue.
There's an interesting stat in the report. It says agencies issued more than 2,400 regulations last year, while Congress passed only 68 laws. What does that tell you about the role of the administrative state in keeping all of our government operations flowing?
Yeah, so again, as kind of Finn had mentioned, this kind of speaks towards the centralization of the power to regulate, and it kind of shows the trend of kind of keeping Congress out of the process as much as possible.
And Finn, what should folks be looking for as they're thinking towards their 2026 regulatory agendas?
The thing I've really been paying attention to is that there was so much done through executive orders this past year, and a lot of that is directing agencies to write rules, to propose rules, that sort of thing. And we're not going to necessarily see the results of that overnight. I mean, we had earlier in the year 4 executive orders on streamlining nuclear power come out. And only this past week did we see, to the best of my knowledge, the first rule come out of that. That was a categorical exclusion for advanced nuclear reactors. And so I think the thing to watch out for this year is just what comes out of this huge volume of executive orders that were directing agencies to promulgate rules. I think other than that, keep watching for what Congress is doing in this regard. There's been, I think, a renewed interest in revisiting some of these things like environmental permitting, like AI, things that didn't have a ton of attention either in general in terms of how things were being regulated, or things like permitting that weren't necessarily very salient over the past 30, 40 years, but only in the past few years have they really gotten Congress's attention. And so I think it kind of shows that there might be renewed interest by Congress in terms of regulation.
I've been speaking with Matthias Vesperoni and Finn Dobkin, both from the George Washington University Regulatory Studies Center. Thank you both for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, it's starting to feel like Census Groundhog Day. The same warning signs from 2020 are showing up again for 2030. But first, the search for the next Comptroller General is turning into a mystery, and no one even knows when the process will begin. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. With Gene Didaro's 15-year term closed out and Oris Williams-Brown leading the Government Accountability Office in an acting capacity, Congress and the administration now face a high-stakes selection governed by one of the most bipartisan appointment processes in government. The next GAO leader must balance independence, expertise, and credibility to keep the work above politics. Janice Luong from the Project on Government Oversight joins me to break down what comes next. Janice, thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, Terry. Always great to be here.
Hey, we're going to talk about a very important position, the Comptroller General of the United States. Gene Didaro just retired at the end of December after completing a 15-year term as Comptroller General. And we haven't heard much about what's going to go on behind the scenes to backfill that position. Tell me from Pogo's perspective, what's so important about this position and what's at stake?
Sure. So the Comptroller General position is there to essentially ensure that the tires are running in the right direction and that the cogs in the machine are well oiled. They essentially lead the operations of the GAO and evaluate the agency's impact. They set the work standard and culture. And if we look back at Gene Didaro's tenure, one aspect of this is to improve financial literacy. That was something that he has mentioned during his confirmation hearing, and that was something that we have heard him speak about throughout his tenure. So that is one aspect of culture that I think is really important. And not only is the Comptroller General responsible for auditing domestically, but also they engage in international audit-related forums. And to that end, the goal is to strengthen global accountability and to share best practices. And I think that speaks to the caliber and standard of the agency in of itself. They're also responsible for communicating the work that they produce before Congress. And this could look like submitting reports and correspondence or testifying before Congress. The Comptroller General is, by design and practice, nonpartisan and independent, and the effectiveness of the agency is only as good as the person leading it, because the Comptroller General has to work with both Democrats and Republicans, and indeed they have collaborated, and I think the positive impact of their work is evident, given that, throughout the years, the federal government has implemented on average 75% of their recommendations. And when Dodaro exited, if you look at the GAO's website under his biography, you'll see that there are commendations by members of Congress, by both the Senate and the House. So to that end, I very much look forward to seeing how our current acting Comptroller General, Oris Williams, will lead this agency during this time.
Janice, one of the things you didn't mention is that the Comptroller General works for Congress and GAO is a party on the legislative branch, not the executive branch, even though the Comptroller General is nominated by the president. How does that dynamic play out?
Correct. So it's quite interesting, I guess. Like you can say that throughout history there has been tensions throughout the executive branch and Congress. When the appointment process was established in 1980 by the Government Accounting Office Act, it actually took 10 years for us to get here. So its first deliberation started in 1970. Within those 10 years, the executive branch and legislative branch went back and forth on the authority and scope of the GAO. And the appointment process is deliberately complex. It requires bicameral and bipartisan cooperation. And when going back to the process itself, when Congress convenes a 10-member commission to recommend at least 3 candidates to the president has to choose from that list, or the president can request additional names. This is how it was historically done, and this is how it's expected to be done. But legislators in the past have also acknowledged that the president can nominate someone outside of that commission's list, and then the president chooses from the list, or the president can request additional names. This is how it was historically done, and it's how it's expected to be done. And after the president chooses, it goes back to the Senate, and the full Senate votes to confirm or reject the nominee.
I'm speaking with Janice Luong. She's a policy associate at the Project on Government Oversight's Effective and Accountable Government team. Well, Janice, they didn't have a nominee. The commission didn't meet before Mr. Dodaro retired. What are you hearing about the process? Is it getting underway?
So with this question, I will lean heavily on the beauty of saying, I'm not sure. I don't have an answer to that. It's been pretty quiet around here. And again, Oris Williams right now is in an acting capacity, and this was a position that Dodaro has had as well for 2 years before he was officially appointed. And the one thing that I could speak to on this is just to highlight that the position Oris Williams is in at this point does not necessarily mean that she is out of the running to be officially appointed as well. There is no statutory deadline requiring Congress to begin the appointment process. So we will see.
Are there particular qualities or characteristics or professional certifications that a Comptroller General needs to have?
I think first and foremost, the most important quality is for the Comptroller General to be independent and nonpartisan. They have to be ethical, of course. I mean, when you are the top accountability watchdog, you don't expect any less. Now, the Comptroller General manages a large cohort of government employees. So when they have some experience in financial management, auditing experience, that comes with the territory. And they also need to have oversight and accountability expertise. And as Jean Dodaro said, being Comptroller General and the agency in itself, it is a people's business. So being able to navigate contentious waters, partisan maneuvers by Congress, that is very important. That is more of an art than a concrete skill, but that is a quality that is very important for its effectiveness.
When you think about those qualities, Janice, are there folks who rise to the top of a potential consideration list beyond Oris Williams-Brown, who's currently the acting?
So at this moment, POGO is looking to our Inspector General's community to get more information on who would be suitable for this position. And POGO is also exploring different options out there in terms of who we think would be best fit for this position. But that is my long-winded way of saying we don't have a specific individual in mind, but we are definitely exploring options.
You've walked us through how the process is supposed to work, what considerations are supposed to be taken into account as folks get nominated. But this year, this administration has sort of defied every expected process for some of these nominations. How does the intersection of the political environment, the priorities, and the pressures, do you think, going to come together to shape this process? Do you expect it to unroll exactly as it's written, or are you expecting it to be somewhat different?
So regarding whether this process will run smoothly this time around, my short answer would lean on no more than yes, although I am holding my breath on it. I'm going to be optimistic. But if we go back to the Clinton and Obama administration, Republicans and Democrats also clashed on which names to add onto the list. During the Clinton administration, each party sent a separate list of nominees to the president and eventually appointed David Walker. During Obama's administration, while both parties were forming a list, the commission's list, Democrats separately sent a list to Obama, and Republicans followed suit. Obama decided to choose Jean Dodaro, who was on the commission's list, and received broad support from both parties. So in both instances, both received unanimous Senate confirmation. And I think it really goes to show that while Congress had their own partisan maneuvers and each party struggled to agree, the presidents respected the process overall. And it really shows how effective it is to have at least one independent actor that guardrails the process. And going back to the question of the tensions and dynamics between the legislative branch and executive branch, I think it'll be interesting to see how they will handle deliberations this time around. I see it as a test for both the president and Congress on whether they will allow partisan gridlock to compromise the very thing that they have repeatedly championed, which is holding the government accountable for the interest of the public, specifically by rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse.
I've been speaking with Janice Long. She's a policy associate at the Project on Government Oversight's Effective and Accountable Government team. Janice, thanks so much for walking us through this process. We're going to keep our fingers crossed.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, it's starting to feel like Census Groundhog Day. The same warning signs from 2020 are showing up again for 2030. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The Census Project says the warning signs are back. calling the path to 2030 a Census Groundhog Day moment that echoes the trouble of 2020. From lagging timelines to unresolved operational risks, their reports suggest the Bureau is once again running out of runway. Steve Jost and Howard Feinberg join me to explain what's at stake. Steve is a senior advisor for Evoke and a consultant to the Census Project. Howard is Senior VP for Advocacy at the Insights Association and co-director of the Census Project. Steve and Howard, it's so lovely to have you both on the show this morning.
Great to be here.
Steve, I want to start with you. A recent report from the Census Project says it feels like Census Groundhog Day. What do you mean by that?
Well, we're glad to be here, Terry. Thank you for inviting us. And what we mean by it is this administration seems to be rerunning the bad planning in advance of the 2020 decennial count, which was widely considered one of the lowest quality census in this century. Now, most of that was due to the timing of COVID while we were conducting that 2020 census, but there were a lot of other operational issues, including Congress not funding the testing regimen that was put in place before that census. And they cut back tests in 16, in 18, and in 17. And I was there at the Census Bureau for both the 2000 and the 2010 decennial counts, and we got hammered by the General Accounting Office every year for not having sufficient testing. And they were big on end-to-end testing. And when you have such a massive, diverse country, diverse geography, diverse population, you need to customize the census for localities, and not testing in enough localities is going to lead to a problem.
Howard, Steve has just mentioned some problems that are starting to recur again. We're still 4 years out from the 2030 census. What are the main warning signs from your perspective that lead to this concern about how we're preparing for 2030?
Well, I mean, I think we've already been on a similar trajectory as the last decade in terms of, continuing resolutions as a method of funding the Census Bureau, as it's, works for many agencies these days. That means that a lot of preparations and research gets kind of punted ahead because the Bureau never is entirely certain how much money they will have available to conduct things. That was the primary driver for the elimination of almost all the tests in the last decade. Continuing resolutions, government shutdowns, that all meant that they didn't really know if they'd be able to fund tests, and thus we were reduced in the 2020 census cycle to a test of only Providence, Rhode Island, which does not capture a whole lot as it relates to the diversity of the entire country. So there were no tests in the last cycle of rural areas, remote areas, native populations, they had tribal areas. Like, there are whole swaths of the country there was no testing done whatsoever. That led to some of the inaccuracies that came out in the 2020 census, and that they were just going in kind of unprepared in many respects. The Bureau does their best, but there's only so much they can do without testing. And this time around, the 2026 census test was scheduled with 6 different sites, for the most part, very different splotches of the country, designed to really get that diversity of populations and different kinds of areas, different kinds of group quarters, in addition to individual households. And that's been reduced to only 2 sites in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and Huntsville, Alabama. There are political and, I assume, financial reasons behind the reduction to those specific spots, but it does mean that the rural and remote areas are left out in the cold. And that's one of the areas where we had a lot of issues with inaccurate counting in the 2020 census. So you'd think you would want to prepare and turn that situation around when you're getting ready for the 2030 census. And I'm worried that that's not going to happen under this kind of plan.
Steve, let me come back to you because Howard has just talked about the importance of these tests. What does the Bureau need right now to stay on schedule? Do they need more money? Do they need more people? Do they need new technology? Do they need all of the above?
Well, it's a great question, and there are a lot of things they need. They need more time. They need more money. They're using technology, and you have to test that. There's an online response, and you have to test how people respond to the online questionnaire and if there's any problems with it. The census is labeled as the largest peacetime mobilization that the government conducts. It's $13 to $15 billion over a 10-year span. It's 750 to 800,000 temporary employees hired and deployed in a year ending in zero. And unlike an aircraft carrier where you get to test it out on the seas before you deploy it for a military mission, you got to get it right the first time with the census. There is no chance to redo it. And that's why the tests are so vital, to make sure that you've covered every base, every undercounted population, new methods. The biggest undercounted population is young children, by the way. People misunderstand that the form is about adults and they leave their children off. And that requires a really diverse education campaign to explain to people, no, we need to know everybody who's in your household, even if they're not related to you.
I'm speaking with Steve Jost, who's Senior Advisor at Evoke and a consultant to the Census Project, and Howard Feinberg, who is a Senior VP for Advocacy at the Insights Association and co-director of the Census Project. Howard, let me come back to you. We've talked about testing. We've talked about funding shortfalls. What are the biggest operational risks if these issues don't get resolved soon?
Biggest operational risks, well, there are a whole bunch, I think, but testing is a key to figuring out how you're going to be able to deal with unexpected circumstances, and not just the expected. You'd have to prepare for known unknowns and unknown unknowns. The last cycle we had COVID, which was definitely in the unknown unknowns as far as anyone I know. But who knows what happens next? And you need to be prepared to roll with the punches. And I think that means the Bureau needs to be focusing on core functions and its big picture demands. At the Insights Association, where we represent the market research and analytics industry, we've been very focused on trying to keep the Bureau on task instead of experimenting with attempts to compete with private industry, which they've done against our own industry, trying to build big public online panels, which they don't know how to do and have failed miserably at. We want them on task and putting all their resources and their attention to being prepared for this massive count of the population, because they only get one shot at it every decade.
Steve, the census data is so important to programs at all levels of government, federal, state, and local. And yet the approach the government seems to be taking is a little passive aggressive. It's almost like we don't actually want to know the census data, because then we'd have to do something with it. So as you look at all of these conflicts and shortfalls, what is the impact if the 2030 census doesn't get a good count?
Well, it's pervasive across the country for a decade. The census numbers are used to determine federal funding, $1.6 trillion in spending, according to the Census Bureau, is determined by census results. So you have that. If you're undercounted in Des Moines, for whatever reason, then you're going to suffer with underfunding in Des Moines for the rest of the decade. And, the census folks, I'm not going to go to motivations. I think it's just a misunderstanding of the complexity of the task. The Census Bureau has to go out and count people that are living on motorhomes, living on boats, in tree houses, in converted garage apartments that weren't reported to the local government and don't have a mailing address of their own. And they're not a law enforcement agency. They don't care about your status, but they do have an obligation to try to count everyone. And, we even have to count the Unabomber, who famously didn't want to get counted or discovered by anybody, but when the FBI found his cabin in the forest, they found a census form hanging on the doorknob.
Howard, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, and I think the impact is also across all other research that's done in the country, including all the other research by the federal government. There's always an assumption that we can just sort of back up and, if we make a mistake in the decennial, we'll just plug it in with the American Community Survey data, because that's the old census long form now every year. But the American Community Survey is building its sampling frame off of the census data from the decennial, as is every other survey in the country, both private and public sector. So all the decision making in the country is ultimately coming back to information out of the decennial.
So, Howard, what are the most urgent actions that Congress needs to take in the coming months to prevent a repeat of last cycle where, as Steve said, it was the worst count in recent memory?
Well, certainly immediately getting in touch with the administration about the 2026 test, I think, is the biggest priority, and being very vigilant on that front. But after that, it's getting ready and passing funding for the Bureau, including giving them authority across multiple years to spend it so that they're not stuck when CRs pop up.
I've been speaking with Steve Jost and Howard Feinberg. Steve is an advisor at Evoke and a consultant to the Census Project. Howard has been co-director of the Census Project and is senior VP for advocacy at the Insights Association. Thank you both for keeping us up to date on this important project.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having us.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Over the last several weeks, lawmakers have been examining several bills that would affect federal employees in different ways. The House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, in particular, recently advanced legislation that may bring changes to federal benefits and hiring practices. Joining me with a review of these bills is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Nice to see you, Terry.
It's good to hear that there's some movement on bills that would support the federal workforce. Let's talk about one that would raise the pay ceiling for employee buyouts. Tell us more about why lawmakers are considering that change.
Absolutely. So the reason that they are looking into this more closely is because there is currently a cap on what's called the Voluntary Separation Incentive Payment, or VSIP program. Currently, agencies are limited to offering up to $25,000 to federal employees who choose to quit or leave their jobs through that program. But that pay ceiling has not been updated since the mid-1990s, so it's been about 30 years. What they're trying to do here, and the House Oversight Committee recently advanced this legislation with a unanimous vote, is they are going to looking to increase the limit on those payments and offering federal employees up to 6 months of their salary with approval from the agency head if they agree to quit their jobs through this program. There's support for the bill across the aisle. And for example, Representative Nick Langworthy, who introduced the legislation, talked about how the current $25,000 cap is a barrier to what he called responsible workforce management. And he explained a little bit more about why he introduced the bill.
This outdated cap has limited agencies' ability to offer competitive voluntary off-ramps. As a result, the federal government often misses opportunities to reduce payroll costs early and instead turns to more expensive and disruptive alternatives such as involuntary separations, extended administrative leave, or simply paying positions that no longer align with mission needs.
And again, that's Representative Nick Langworthy, a Republican from New York. During the committee markup, when they were looking at this bill, there was also support from Congressman James Walkinshaw, a Democrat from Virginia, who supported the legislation and saying that the increase was long overdue. And this is especially considering that even though the program has been around for decades, it's not something that's come into the forefront more recently with the Trump administration's efforts to reduce the workforce and been used a lot more than it has been in the past by agencies.
Well, that bill focuses on departures. There's another one from the Oversight Committee that would push agencies towards skill-based hiring. So tell us more about that approach to bringing more people in.
Absolutely. So we've seen many different variations of this type of legislation over the years. It typically gets bipartisan support, this push towards skills-based hiring. And in this particular instance, there is a bill through the Oversight Committee called the Cybersecurity Hiring Modernization Act. This is another one where it's gotten very strong bipartisan support. It advanced unanimously out of the committee earlier this month, and the idea here is to remove the educational requirements or background for job candidates who apply for cyber roles into different agencies. So this would cover the GS 2210 or IT management series and several other cybersecurity positions where in most cases, unless there's some sort of legal requirement, agencies would not be able to require an educational background like a 4-year college degree. And the idea is to try to open doors to more diverse backgrounds and more diverse candidates and get also a lot more younger employees into these types of positions. This is something that has been pushed on for many years. We've seen efforts from both the Trump and Biden administrations promoting skills-based hiring. And Representative Nancy Mace, who introduced this new legislation, talked a little bit more about her thinking behind the bill.
Degree requirements function as a poor substitute for what actually matters in the labor market: merit, skills, and talent. A diploma may signal someone mostly showed up somewhere for a few years, but it does not reliably indicate whether a worker can perform the tasks a job requires, adapt to new technologies, or contribute productively.
And again, that's Representative Nancy Mace, a Republican from South Carolina. We also have heard recently from Shontel Brown, the Congresswoman from Ohio, who is the Democrat lead co-sponsor of this bill, and she similarly advocated for this move away from educational requirements.
This bill does not lower the qualifications, but instead recognizes educational experience is not one size fits all. It will help level the playing field for veterans, community college graduates, career changers, and people who have had non-traditional educational pathways.
Drew, those last two bills that you mentioned both have bipartisan support, but of course that's not always the case. There's a recent Democrat-led effort on a big federal pay raise. Tell us more about the FAIR Act and its prospects.
This is one that we have come to expect every January or February ahead of what we see in March from the White House's budget request, which usually tees up the initial proposal for next year's federal pay raise. So ahead of that, we typically see the FAIR Act come in for at least the last decade. And it's a little bit different every year in terms of what lawmakers propose through this. But this year, they're looking at a 4.1% pay raise, and this would be a 3.1% raise for all federal employees across the board, and then an average of a 1% locality pay adjustment on top of that. But because this is a Democrat-led bill and doesn't really have a lot of Republican support, the prospects of this advancing are not as likely as you saw some of those other bills. And Congress, even though this bill has been introduced for at least the last 10 years, it's not ever gotten a lot of momentum, and federal pay raises each year tend to fall short of what the bill proposes. But the bill does get a lot of support from employee organizations and federal unions. We heard more about this bill from Doreen Greenwald, national president of the National Treasury Employees Union.
It's vital that federal employees are fairly compensated for the important work they do. If the federal government is to compete for talent and rebuild the workforce, we need to offer competitive pay.
Well, those are three important ones. Are there any other bills that you're tracking right now?
There are several where we saw some movement in December, so just a couple of months ago. At that time, the Oversight Committee advanced several other bills that would also impact federal employees. There are some that just have Republican support, for instance, one about the federal probationary period, and then one that it looks at detailed reporting on federal employees' use of official time. But there was also some bipartisan legislation, one on, again, skills-based hiring, but that time for federal contractors. And then also looking at amending the system for relocation incentives for federal employees. Those bills are all currently under consideration, and they did advance out of the committee, but have not seen much movement since the end of 2025. So those are ones that I'll continue to track for the next couple months.
Drew, do you think now that we have the Federal Workforce Caucus that will change the prospects for any of these bills?
It's possible. I think that, having federal employees come more into the forefront and more into the conversation from that caucus, it's possible that there could be more conversations and more discussions about pushing some of this legislation forward, but only time will tell.
It's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for this update.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editors are Daisy Thornton and Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.